My daughter-in-law struck me across the face the moment I told her she could not live in my house. I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even step back. I simply stood there, holding my purse, and realized something very clear. That slap answered every question I had been avoiding. What I did later that same day changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of this story, and let me know what city you're listening from. I never imagined my life would come to this, but I've learned that silence can be far more dangerous than anger. It started with a phone call from my son on a quiet Tuesday morning. I remember it clearly because I was folding laundry, standing in the same kitchen where I'd cooked his favorite meals for decades. His voice sounded rushed, overly cheerful in a way that felt rehearsed. "Mom, we might need a place to stay for a while," he said. I asked why. He hesitated. Then he told me they had sold their house. Not downsized. Not relocated. Sold. Later, I learned the full truth. The house was gone, and $620,000 had been transferred directly into my daughter-in-law's control. Money meant to secure their future, spent freely as if consequences didn't exist. They arrived at my door that afternoon without warning. No suitcases, no apology, just expectation. My daughter-in-law walked in first, scanning my living room the way someone looks at a hotel lobby. My son followed behind her, quiet, avoiding my eyes. I noticed then how small he looked, how distant. She didn't ask if they could stay. She told me they would. I listened. I let her finish. Then I said one word. No. The room went still, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, like the air has stopped moving. My daughter-in-law's face changed instantly. Not surprise, not confusion, anger, sharp and sudden. She stepped closer. Too close. "You owe us," she said. That was when she struck me. The sound echoed louder than it should have. I felt it burn, not just on my skin, but somewhere deeper. My son didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, frozen, as if watching a stranger's life unfold. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten her. I didn't tell her to leave. I simply turned, walked to my bedroom, and closed the door. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the room I had paid for, maintained, and protected for over 40 years. Every piece of furniture had a memory. Every wall had heard laughter, arguments, and forgiveness. I realized then that this wasn't just about money or housing. It was about boundaries, and the moment I enforced one, I became the enemy. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, fed the birds in the backyard like I always do. I moved slowly, deliberately, calm on the outside, focused on the inside. I didn't call my son. I called my lawyer. Not out of anger, out of clarity. By noon, paperwork was in motion, quietly, legally, permanently. My daughter-in-law thought my silence meant weakness. She thought the slap had ended the conversation. She was wrong, and she wouldn't realize just how wrong she was until the papers arrived. The morning after the slap felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight came through the kitchen window at the same angle it always had, landing on the worn corner of the countertop where my husband used to rest his coffee mug. I stood there longer than necessary, holding my own cup, waiting for the anger to arrive. It didn't. Instead, there was a quiet clarity that settled into my chest, heavy but steady. I replayed the last 48 hours in my mind, not with emotion, but with attention, like someone reviewing footage they hadn't noticed before. My son had called 3 days earlier. That was the first crack. He hadn't asked how I was. He hadn't mentioned work. He went straight to logistics, timing, space. Just for a little while, he said, as if words could shrink consequences. I remembered how quickly he'd mentioned the house being sold. No details, no explanation, just a statement, dropped casually, as if selling a home was no more significant than changing phone plans. At the time, I told myself not to pry. I had raised him to be independent, to make his own decisions. I had trusted that. Standing alone in my kitchen, I realized how carefully he had avoided the truth. They hadn't sold the house because they had to. They sold it because they wanted freedom, and they had mistaken my home for their safety net. I moved through the house slowly that morning, noticing things I had ignored before. A faint scuff on the hallway wall where my daughter-in-law's suitcase had brushed past. Her coat draped over a chair she hadn't asked to use. Her shoes by the door, already placed as if they belonged there. I picked up one of those shoes and set it back outside. Not as a statement, just as a correction. My son hadn't come to speak to me. He stayed in the guest room, door closed, phone buzzing every few minutes. I could hear their voices through the walls sometimes. Hers sharp, his low and uncertain. I realized then that the slap hadn't been sudden. It had been practiced in smaller ways for months. The tone, the entitlement, the assumption that I would bend because I always had before. I sat at the dining table and opened an old folder I kept tucked away in the cabinet. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at since my husband passed. Property records, account summaries, copies, neatly organized because that was how we'd lived our lives. Careful. Prepared. As I read through them, something became very clear. My daughter-in-law knew far less than she believed. The house was not an emotional asset. It was a legal one, and it had boundaries she could not cross with a raised hand or a louder voice. I thought about the moment she stepped closer to me, the way her eyes had hardened, not with fear, but with confidence. The kind that comes from believing someone else will clean up the mess. She believed my son would protect her. She believed my age made me passive. She believed silence meant surrender. That afternoon, I left the house for the first time since they arrived. I drove to the post office, then to the bank, then home again. Each stop felt deliberate, grounding me in the reality of movement, of control. When I returned, they were both in the living room, talking quietly. When they saw me, they stopped. No apology came, no acknowledgement. My daughter-in-law avoided my face, not out of shame, but calculation. I went to my room and closed the door. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Because for the first time since my husband died, I wasn't wondering what I should do. I already knew. And while they whispered plans in the next room, papers were already moving in places they couldn't see. The storm they thought had passed was only gathering strength. By the third day, patterns began to surface. Not loud ones, quiet ones. The kind you only notice when you stop excusing behavior and start observing it. My son barely spoke to me unless it was necessary. When he did, his words were careful, measured, as if every sentence had been rehearsed. He asked about groceries, about the thermostat, never about my face, never about what had happened. My daughter-in-law moved through my home as if she were already in charge of it. She rearranged things without asking, left cabinets open, took phone calls in the living room, speaking in a low voice but never bothering to hide her tone. Once I heard her laugh. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was sharp, confident, the kind of sound someone makes when they believe the outcome is already decided. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, pretending to read. In truth, I was listening to the pauses between their words, to what wasn't being said. They were planning something. I caught fragments. Timing. Paperwork. She won't push back. My name was never mentioned directly, but I was the center of every sentence. It struck me then that this wasn't about shelter. They hadn't come to my house because they were desperate. They came because they were positioning themselves. I remembered how my daughter-in-law had looked around the living room when she first arrived. Not admiring. Assessing, like someone checking measurements. That night, I went into the hallway closet and pulled out another folder. This one thinner. Updated recently. I hadn't thought much of it when I signed the documents months earlier. At the time, it felt responsible. Routine. Now, reading through it slowly, I realized how much foresight matters when silence follows loss. My husband had believed in preparation, in structure. He used to say chaos thrives where people assume too much. I understood him better in that moment than I ever had while he was alive. The next morning, my daughter-in-law finally addressed me, not with an apology, with an instruction. "We need to talk about long-term arrangements," she said, standing in my doorway without knocking. I looked up from my chair and waited. She continued, explaining things as if I were a child, talking about space, about comfort, about what would be easier for everyone. She never once asked what I wanted. When she finished, I nodded. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. She seemed satisfied with that, as if my silence had confirmed her expectations. After she left, I didn't move for several minutes. I sat there, hands folded, replaying her words, not their meaning, their assumptions. She assumed I would cooperate. She assumed I would shrink. She assumed age had softened my edges. What she didn't understand was that time sharpens some people. That afternoon, my lawyer called. Not with drama, with clarity. He spoke carefully, explaining options, boundaries, steps that didn't require confrontation. I listened, asked a few questions, took notes. When the call ended, I closed my notebook and placed it back in the drawer where it belonged. That evening, my son joined me in the kitchen while I was making tea. He stood awkwardly by the counter, hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, "we're just trying to figure things out." I turned the kettle off and faced him. "So am I," I replied. He looked relieved, mistaking my calm for compliance. That misunderstanding would cost him more than he realized. That night, I slept with the door locked. Not out of fear, out of intention. Because the truth had finally settled in. They didn't come to me for help. They came to take. And while they believed they were in control, they had already underestimated the one thing that mattered most. I was still standing, and I was no longer guessing. That night, memories began surfacing without warning. Not dramatic ones. Small, ordinary moments I had once dismissed as nothing. Comments, glances, silences that now carried weight. I remembered the first time my daughter-in-law corrected me in front of others. It had been years ago at a family dinner. I had laughed it off then, telling myself she was just confident, just modern, just different. Later came the suggestions, where I should sit, what I should wear, how I should speak to my own son. Each time subtle, polite, easy to excuse. I excused them all. I thought about the holidays I spent alone while they traveled, the phone calls that grew shorter, the way my son began checking with his wife before answering simple questions. None of it felt alarming at the time. It felt gradual, reasonable, life moving forward. But patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves when it's too late to pretend. That evening, I sat at the dining table with an old photo album open in front of me. My husband and I in our 30s, then 40s, then older, smiling in front of this same house. A house we worked for, paid off, and protected. He used to tell me, "People show you who they are when they think you have nothing left to offer." I didn't understand that sentence until now. I realized my daughter-in-law had never seen me as family. I was a resource, a backup plan. A name on paper she assumed would disappear with time, and my son, my own child, had let that happen. The next morning, I woke early again, not from anxiety, from purpose. I made breakfast as usual, set the table, moved through the routine calmly. They joined me, one at a time. My daughter-in-law spoke freely, as if nothing had happened. She talked about appointments, expenses, and timelines, about what made sense. I listened. My son nodded along, occasionally glancing at me, as if waiting for approval. I gave none. At one point, she mentioned my age. Not directly, just enough to imply concern, comfort, care. I smiled. She mistook it for agreement. After breakfast, they left the house together. I watched their car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. For the first time in days, the house was quiet again. I walked through every room slowly. Not emotionally, intentionally. I opened drawers, checked cabinets, counted what mattered, and noted what didn't. In the study, I sat at my husband's old desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thin envelope he had asked me to keep safe years ago. I hadn't opened it since his funeral. Inside were notes. Clear. Practical. Prepared. He had trusted me to use them when the time came. The realization didn't make me sad. It steadied me. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from my daughter-in-law. Short, confident, about plans, about expectations. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the envelope back in the drawer, locked it, and wrote down one date on a notepad. Not a deadline. A marker. Because what they believed was a slow takeover was actually a countdown they didn't know had started. That evening, when they returned, I was calm, polite, unchanged. They believed nothing had shifted. But something had. I wasn't remembering the past to feel pain. I was remembering it to make sure it never repeated itself. And for the first time, I wasn't acting as a mother, trying to hold her family together. I was acting as a woman protecting what was hers. By the fifth day, the balance inside the house had shifted. Not because of anything said out loud, but because of what stopped being hidden. My daughter-in-law no longer pretended. She spoke as if decisions had already been made. She referenced plans I had never agreed to, appointments I hadn't scheduled, conversations I hadn't been part of. She talked about the house as if it were temporary, not for them, for me. I heard the phrase next stage more than once. My son followed her lead, quietly, faithfully. He repeated her words, softened them, tried to make them sound reasonable. He spoke about convenience, about what was best long-term. He never asked if I was willing. That afternoon, I was in the living room when she sat down across from me. No anger, no shouting, just certainty. "We need to make things official," she said. I waited. She explained that staying together wasn't sustainable, that space mattered, that independence mattered. She framed it as concern, as care. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if delivering news I should already accept. Then she mentioned alternatives, places nearby, communities designed for people my age. She smiled when she said it. I noticed how relaxed she looked, how confident, as if the outcome had already been settled somewhere I wasn't invited. I nodded once. She leaned back, satisfied. That night, I reviewed the notes I had written over the past few days. Dates, phrases, actions. I didn't write feelings. I wrote facts. Facts hold weight. Feelings disappear. I remembered something my husband once said during a difficult negotiation years ago. Never interrupt someone while they believe they're winning. So I didn't. The next morning, I received a call from the bank. Routine. Polite. Confirming details related to recent activity connected to my son's account history. Information I hadn't asked for, but listened to carefully. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long moment. The picture was complete now. That afternoon, my lawyer called again. We spoke briefly, precisely. No raised voices, no dramatics, just clarity. He confirmed what I already suspected. Certain assumptions had been made, certain boundaries crossed, certain documents would not hold under scrutiny. I thanked him and ended the call. That evening, dinner was tense but controlled. My daughter-in-law spoke less. My son watched me closely, searching my face for signs. They were waiting for something. An argument, a refusal, a breakdown. They got none. After dinner, I washed my plate and placed it carefully in the cabinet. I wiped the counter, turned off the light. I moved as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Later that night, I heard them whispering behind closed doors. Urgent tones. Frustration slipping through the cracks. I didn't strain to listen. I didn't need to anymore. The truth had already settled. They believed they were guiding me toward a corner, toward an exit they had designed. What they didn't understand was that I had already stepped somewhere else entirely. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to respond. And when I finally did, it wouldn't sound like anger. It would sound like paperwork. Signed, filed, delivered. They slept that night, believing time was on their side. They were wrong. Because while they planned my future in whispered conversations, mine was already being secured in ink. By the sixth day, the house felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. Every room carried tension that hadn't been there before. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when I entered. My daughter-in-law watched me carefully now. No longer relaxed, no longer careless. Something had shifted. She could feel it. That morning, I woke before anyone else. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes I'd worn many times before. Nothing dramatic, nothing new. Familiarity has a way of calming the mind. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote 3 names at the top of the page. Mine, my son's, hers. Under each name, I wrote facts. Only facts. Dates, transfers, conversations I could verify, actions I could prove. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. When my son came into the kitchen, he froze for a moment when he saw me writing. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, pretending not to look. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. I nodded. "I am." He seemed relieved. He took that as reassurance, as permission to stop worrying. That was his mistake. Later that afternoon, my daughter-in-law approached me again. This time, her tone was different. Controlled, polite, almost careful. She suggested we sit down together. She used words like family and understanding. She talked about stress, about pressure, about how difficult things had been for her. She never mentioned the slap. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her for sharing her thoughts. Nothing more. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected that. That evening, I stepped out of the house alone. I drove to a small office park across town. Not new to me. Familiar. Quiet. I walked into my attorney's office without hesitation. We reviewed everything again. Slowly. Carefully. He asked questions. I answered them directly. No embellishment. No emotion. He nodded more than he spoke. At one point, he closed the folder in front of him and looked at me steadily. "You've been patient," he said, "but patience doesn't mean inaction." I agreed. We discussed next steps. Not confrontations, procedures, notices, protections already in place that could now be enforced. When I left his office, it was dark outside. The parking lot lights hummed softly above me. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. When I returned home, the house was quiet. My son and his wife were in their room. Their door was closed. I made myself tea and sat alone at the dining table. I reviewed my notes one last time, then folded the paper and placed it inside my purse. Not because I was afraid to leave it out, because it was finished. The next morning would look ordinary to them. Breakfast, small talk, routine. They wouldn't know that a process had already begun. One that didn't require my approval anymore. I slept deeply that night, not because I was unaware of what was coming, but because I was prepared. For the first time since they walked into my home with expectations instead of respect, I wasn't reacting. I was executing. And while they believed control belonged to whoever spoke the loudest, I understood something far more important. Control belongs to the one who moves quietly first. By the 7th day, the truth began surfacing on its own, not through confrontation, through details. My son started asking questions he hadn't asked before, quiet ones, casual ones. He asked about the house, about how long it had been in my name, about paperwork I kept and where I kept it. He asked as if he were curious. I answered as if I were calm. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked her phone that day, how her confidence came and went in waves. She paced while pretending to tidy up. She stepped outside to take calls and returned with her jaw set tight. Something wasn't aligning the way she expected. That afternoon, I received an email from my attorney. Short, clear, confirming that records had been requested and that responses were coming in faster than anticipated. I read it once, then again. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, just momentum. Later, while I was in the kitchen, my daughter-in-law walked in holding her phone. She stood across from me, tapping the screen nervously. "Have you talked to anyone lately?" she asked. I looked up slowly. "Why do you ask?" She smiled too quickly, just wondering. I returned to what I was doing. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary, then left the room. That evening, my son finally sat down across from me at the table. He looked tired, not angry, confused. "Mom," he said, "I think we need to make sure everything's clear, about finances, about ownership, just so there aren't misunderstandings." I folded my napkin neatly and met his eyes. "Clarity is important," I said. He nodded, relieved by my agreement. He didn't hear the warning in it. The next morning, a letter arrived addressed to me. Plain envelope, no return logo. Inside was confirmation I'd been waiting for. Dates matched, transfers aligned, assumptions collapsed. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt ready. That afternoon, my attorney called. He spoke carefully, explaining what the documents meant and what they allowed us to do next. He asked if I wanted to proceed. "Yes," I said. No hesitation. When the call ended, I sat quietly in the living room. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, landing on the same couch where my daughter-in-law had sat days earlier, speaking as if my future were already decided. I thought about how easily confidence can turn into panic when certainty disappears. That evening, my daughter-in-law's tone changed again. She was polite, almost deferential. She asked if I needed anything, offered to help with dinner, laughed at comments she would have ignored before. My son watched closely, unsure which version of her to follow. They both sensed the ground shifting. Neither of them understood why. Before bed, I gathered a few personal items and placed them neatly in a drawer, not to hide them, to keep them in order. I slept deeply that night, because the pieces were now in place. The narrative they had been building, that I was confused, emotional, easily redirected, no longer held. What they didn't know yet was that the process had moved beyond conversations. The truth was no longer something I carried alone. It was documented, verified, and moving forward without their permission. The next steps would not require raised voices or explanations. They would arrive quietly, in envelopes, with dates. And once they did, there would be no pretending left. Only consequences, unfolding exactly as written. By the 8th day, silence became a strategy. Not avoidance, not fear. Control. I spoke less, moved normally, ate meals at the same time, kept routines intact. To anyone watching, nothing appeared different. That was the point. My daughter-in-law filled the quiet with effort. She cooked meals she'd never offered to cook before, asked polite questions, smiled too often. Each gesture landed a second too late, like a performance that had missed its cue. My son watched her closely now. He noticed the change, but didn't comment on it. He had begun to sense that something was wrong, but not enough to name it. Uncertainty does that to people. It makes them careful. That afternoon, the mail arrived earlier than usual. I retrieved it calmly and sorted through it at the kitchen counter. Bills. Flyers. Then one envelope, heavier than the rest. I didn't open it right away. I placed it neatly on the table and continued with my day. From the corner of my eye, I saw my daughter-in-law notice it. Her attention lingered. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. She tried not to stare. I left the room without the envelope. An hour later, I returned and picked it up. I opened it slowly, deliberately, making no effort to hide the sound of paper unfolding. Inside were copies, confirmations, dates and signatures aligned in black ink. Clear, precise, final. I read everything once, then I placed the papers back inside the envelope and slid it into my bag. That evening, tension crept into the house like humidity before a storm. My daughter-in-law paced again, took another call outside, lowered her voice even more than before. My son asked if everything was okay. "It is," I said. He nodded, accepting the answer because it sounded calm. Because calm had always meant safe. That night, I heard them arguing quietly behind their closed door. Not shouting, whispers sharp enough to cut, her voice urgent, his defensive. I didn't listen long. What they didn't understand was that arguments don't matter once the outcome is documented. The next morning, I received another call from my attorney. Brief. Informational. Confirming that notices were ready. "Do you want them sent today?" he asked. "Yes," I said. No pause. I spent the rest of the morning doing small, ordinary things. Watered the plants, folded towels, wiped down the counter, grounding myself in reality. By early afternoon, my daughter-in-law approached me again. Her voice was gentle now, careful. "We've been thinking," she said. "Maybe we all just need to slow things down." I looked at her and waited. She continued, choosing her words as if stepping through a narrow space. She talked about misunderstandings, about stress, about wanting peace. She stopped short of apology. I nodded once. She exhaled, visibly relieved. That relief wouldn't last. Later that day, a courier pulled up outside the house. My daughter-in-law saw it first. She froze mid-step as the driver approached the door. I answered it. The envelope was handed to me. I signed for it calmly and closed the door. I didn't open it in front of them. I didn't need to. My daughter-in-law watched me closely now, her face pale, her confidence gone. She knew, not what exactly, but that something irreversible had arrived. That evening, dinner was silent. No one mentioned the envelope. No one laughed. They were waiting for me to speak. I didn't, because the most powerful moment wasn't explaining what I had done. It was letting them feel the weight of what was coming. The papers had been sent. The process was active. And from this point forward, nothing in this house would move according to their assumptions, only according to what was written. And what was written could no longer be undone. By the 9th day, the waiting was over. Not for me. For them. It began with a knock at the door just after breakfast. Not loud. Not urgent. Firm. Professional. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. My daughter-in-law was the first to look up. Her fork paused midair. My son froze, eyes shifting toward the hallway. I stood. "I'll get it," I said. When I opened the door, a man stood there holding a folder and a clipboard. Calm, neutral. He asked my name, then confirmed the address. I nodded. He handed me the envelope and asked for a signature. I signed without hesitation. My hand was steady. Behind me, I could feel them both watching. The door closed quietly. I didn't open the envelope right away. I walked to the kitchen counter and placed it down carefully, aligning it with the edge. Small habits matter in moments like that. My daughter-in-law stood slowly. Too slowly. Her face had gone pale. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew enough to be afraid. My son finally spoke. "Mom, what is that?" "Information," I replied. Nothing more. I opened the envelope and removed the documents. I didn't read them. I already had. I simply glanced at the first page to confirm what I needed to see. Then I slid the papers back into the folder and closed it. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked when she tried to speak. Is this necessary?" I looked at her calmly. "It already is." She sat back down, her confidence draining in real time. The certainty she'd worn for days had vanished, replaced by calculation and fear. My son reached for the papers, then stopped himself. "What does this mean?" he asked quietly. "It means there are boundaries," I said, "and consequences." That was all. The rest of the morning passed in silence. My daughter-in-law retreated to the bedroom, phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently. My son sat at the table long after his coffee had gone cold, staring at nothing. I went about my day. I folded laundry, watered the plants, opened the windows to let fresh air move through the house. Ordinary things. Grounding things. By mid-afternoon, the phone started ringing. My daughter-in-law answered the first call in the bedroom, the second one on the porch. By the third, her voice was shaking. Words like notice, timing, and misunderstanding floated through the hallway. None of it mattered. When she finally came back into the living room, her tone was different. Gone was the authority. Gone was the assumption. She sat across from me, hands clasped tightly. "We need to talk," she said. I waited. She spoke quickly now, explaining, backtracking, reframing. She mentioned stress, pressure, mistakes. She never once mentioned the slap. My son joined her, nodding along, adding words like family and working it out. I listened until they finished. Then I stood. "This conversation is over," I said calmly. "Anything else can go through my attorney." My daughter-in-law's eyes widened. My son looked stunned. "You can't be serious," she said. "I am," I replied. That evening, suitcases appeared in the hallway. Not packed fully. Not yet, but present. The illusion of permanence had broken. Dinner went untouched. That night, I slept peacefully. Because the papers had done what words never could. They had shifted the power. The next steps were no longer emotional. They were procedural. And for the first time since they walked into my home believing they could take over, they understood something they hadn't before. This was no longer a family discussion. It was a legal reality. And it had already begun. By the 10th day, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like an exit. My daughter-in-law woke early that morning. I heard her moving around before sunrise, opening drawers, closing them too quickly. The sound of zippers traveled down the hallway. Not rushed. Careful. Controlled panic has a rhythm of its own. My son sat at the kitchen table when I came in. His shoulders were slumped. He looked older than he had a week ago. Older than he should have. "Mom," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I poured myself coffee before answering. I took my time. "I'm listening," I said. He spoke slowly, choosing words the way someone walks across thin ice. He talked about stress, about things getting out of hand, about how none of this was supposed to happen this way. I waited until he finished. "Some things happen because they're allowed to," I said. He didn't respond. My daughter-in-law entered the kitchen halfway through the conversation. She stopped short when she saw us. Her eyes moved from my face to my son's, searching for reassurance he couldn't give. She tried a different approach this time. Apologies. Not for the slap, not for the entitlement, for the situation, for misunderstandings, for how things had spiraled. She kept her voice soft, careful, as if volume could change outcomes. "I think we all just need to take a breath," she said. "We don't need to make this worse than it already is." I met her eyes. "This isn't escalating," I replied. "It's concluding." She swallowed hard. That afternoon, my attorney called again. Brief update. Confirmations delivered. Timelines set. No surprises. When the call ended, I didn't share the details. I didn't need to. They could feel it. My daughter-in-law stopped making eye contact. She packed quietly now, folding clothes with precision. Each movement carried a weight she hadn't expected to feel. My son hovered between rooms, unsure where he belonged. He asked if I needed help with anything, if I wanted lunch, if I was okay. I was. Later, I watched from the living room window as my daughter-in-law loaded the trunk of their car. She paused once, phone in hand, staring at the screen as if waiting for something to change. Nothing did. When she came back inside, she stood near the door, keys in hand. "We'll stay somewhere else for now," she said. "Just until things calm down." I nodded. My son hesitated. "Mom, I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I said, "but you allowed it." That landed harder than anything else I could have said. They left just before sunset. The sound of the car pulling away felt final. Not dramatic, clean. I stood in the doorway long after the street was empty. That night, I walked through the house room by room. I didn't rush. I touched familiar surfaces, straightened what had been disturbed, closed doors gently. Everything was back where it belonged. Later, I sat alone at the dining table with a cup of tea. The silence felt different now, not heavy, earned. The phone buzzed once, a message from my daughter-in-law. Long, emotional, unsent in my mind before I ever opened it. I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to discuss. The outcome had already been decided, not by anger, not by arguments, but by action taken quietly and correctly. They thought the hardest part would be leaving. They were wrong. The hardest part was realizing they no longer had a place to return to. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door for the night, I understood something clearly. I hadn't lost my family. I had lost the illusion that silence meant weakness, and I had gained back something far more important. My home, my authority, and my peace. By the 11th day, something unexpected happened. They stopped calling. No messages. No long explanations. No emotional appeals disguised as concern. The silence wasn't strategic anymore. It was resigned. I noticed it that morning when I reached for my phone and realized I hadn't checked it since the night before. There was no urgency. No pull. Just space. I made breakfast for one and sat at the table where so many conversations had ended badly in the past 2 weeks. The chair across from me was empty. It stayed that way. Later that day, my son called. Not from her phone, not on speaker, just him. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Careful, uncertain. "Mom," he said, "I just wanted to check in." I waited. "I've been thinking a lot," he continued, "about everything." I could hear the distance between his words, the weight of choices he hadn't expected to have consequences this heavy. "I should have stopped it," he said quietly. "I should have protected you." I didn't interrupt. "I didn't know how things got so far," he added. "I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet." I closed my eyes briefly. Not in pain, in recognition. "That's what I thought too," I said. "For a long time." He was silent on the other end of the line. "I don't expect you to fix this," I continued, "but I do expect you to understand it." "I do," he said. And this time I believed him. We didn't talk long. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no promises. Just honesty, spoken too late to undo damage, but early enough to prevent more. After the call, I sat quietly for a while, not reflecting on what was lost, but on what had finally been named. Respect cannot be negotiated after it's broken. That afternoon, I received confirmation from my attorney that everything was finalized. No pending actions, no loose ends. I thanked him and ended the call. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The house had returned to its rhythm. My rhythm. The floors creaked where they always had. The clock ticked steadily in the hallway. The air felt lighter, as if it had finally been allowed to move again. That evening, I went through the mail and found a letter from my son. Handwritten. Rare. He didn't apologize again. He didn't explain. He wrote that he was learning, that he was beginning to see where he had gone wrong. That he hoped one day things could be different. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not to hide it, to keep it. Some lessons take time to settle. As night fell, I turned off the lights one by one. I stood in the living room for a moment, looking around. Nothing was missing. That was the point. I hadn't reclaimed my home through force or fury. I had reclaimed it through resolve. They had mistaken my patience for permission. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. But silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is restraint. And restraint, when backed by action, changes everything. By the 11th day, I wasn't waiting for anyone to return. I was already moving forward, on my terms. By the 12th day, the house no longer felt like it had survived something. It felt restored. I woke before sunrise, not out of habit, but because my body was finally at ease. The quiet was different now. Not empty, complete. The kind of silence that comes when nothing is being held back. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sky slowly change color. This house had seen many versions of me. A young wife, a tired mother, a grieving widow. And now, something else entirely. A woman who no longer explained herself. I thought about the moment everything shifted. Not the slap, not the papers, not even the knock at the door. The real turning point had been quieter than that. It was the moment I realized I did not need to be understood to be respected. For years, I had softened my words, waited my turn, stayed quiet for the sake of peace. I believed love meant endurance. that patience was proof of loyalty. I was wrong. Patience without boundaries is not kindness. It is permission. My son had learned that lesson too late. My daughter-in-law had never intended to learn it at all. But that was no longer my burden. Later that morning, I walked through the house one last time. Not to check, not to inspect, but to acknowledge it. The living room where decisions had been assumed instead of discussed. The hallway where voices had lowered when I approached. The doorway where entitlement had crossed into something unforgivable. I closed that door gently. In the afternoon, I received one final message. Not an apology, not a demand, just a short note from my son. I understand now. I'm sorry it took so long. I read it once. Then I set the phone down. Understanding, when it arrives late, still matters. But it does not rewrite history. It simply shapes the future. I did not respond. Not because I was angry, because I had said everything that needed to be said with my actions. As evening settled in, I sat at the dining table with a single place setting. No expectation. No waiting. Just presence. I realized then that the story I had been living was never about betrayal alone. It was about awakening, about recognizing that dignity does not require witnesses, that strength does not announce itself, that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not the absence of power, but its refinement. I had not driven anyone away. I had simply stopped making space for those who believed they could take without consequence. That night, before turning off the lights, I stood in the center of my home and took one slow breath. Nothing was missing. No voices echoed. No tension lingered. No fear remained. Only clarity. I did not win by shouting. I did not win by begging. I did not win by proving anything. I won by standing still while everything false fell away. And if there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is this. Being a mother does not mean being silent. Being older does not mean being powerless. And being kind does not mean being expendable. I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. And when I finally chose myself, the story ended exactly where it was meant to, with peace.